So yeah, we do have a couple questions for you guys. And yeah, all three of you can answer, one of you can answer, whatever you feel comfortable with. So the first question that we have for you is, what was your experience organizing a J Street chapter as a young person on your university's campus? Were people receptive to your mission? Were people interested, wanting to be involved, or was there any pushback?
Yeah, I can talk about it, and like Josh can also fill in as needed since we organized on the same campus. So I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that like while we were organizing, it's like we would have like people who were vehemently pro-Israel and like, how dare you think that Palestinians have rights, and that was of course not what they exactly said, but more or less what the conversation it boiled down to. And so we ran into those people, but then we also ran into a lot of people who were like, oh, that sounds totally fair. Like that sounds like such a like a good policy position. And so like a lot of people, I think, generally agree with the conversation, but we also, in the same way, we also have people on the left where you'll have people like, how dare you think that Israel should exist? And there's like a lot of critical thinking that I think was lacking because they also just avoided talking to the other. In fact, during like an Israel week, we had a pro-Israel table. J Street decided that we would just kind of like be around, but we weren't going to take part in it was our Israeli Apartheid Week, which I disagree with a lot of the verbiage that was used during that entire week, but that's what our Students for Justice in Palestine called it. And so our inherently like strictly pro-Israel table, they set up one down this plaza, like probably about 50 feet away. And you would see like these two groups, like they would talk to people passing by and then they would just like stare at each other and glare at each other, but they would never talk. And that's something that I think, like that's what I know I personally went by and like talked to both of them just because it's like, there's literally no point in not talking about this. And so I think one of the hardest parts was like facilitating the conversation between the two polarized groups, because both sides are convinced that they're 100% correct, and that there's nothing you could do otherwise. And they want to get everything that they want without compromise. And that's just frankly unrealistic. There's no way to solve this without compromise. And then I think another kind of portion would be students who grew up in like traditional Jewish homes, and were given a narrative of being pro-Israel and I think Josh can talk more to like exactly this like point that I'm getting at, but they were often scared to actually join the conversation. They were scared to join J Street's part of the conversation. And so I think that was probably the hardest part, and I'll kind of like hand it over to Josh to talk about that real quick.
Yeah, so I think that there's, those two groups that you're talking about are somewhat blended, at least on the Israel side. A lot of even the really polarized, I don't like defining them as purely pro-Israel. I mostly like to have them label them anti-Palestine. I don't think I'm any less pro-Israel than they are. I don't think any of us are. But I think that, so for example, at that Israel Apartheid Week, I did talk, I was friends with people on both sides, and I talked to them. And for the most part, they're perfectly willing to acknowledge all of the facts and narratives that I do privately. But the problem is, what are they willing to say publicly, and why? And the reason is usually because they're afraid if they recognize something from the other side, it delegitimizes their own narrative. That those folks who were at, staffing the pro-Israel table, tearing down all of the lies of the Israel Apartheid Week, many of which were unfortunately not lies, about child detention and other things like that. They were mostly trying to contextualize it because they're just afraid that if people believe that Israel does these bad things, they'll just say, yeah, you know what, you're right, Israel should disappear. Who cares? Why do we need to protect it? Which isn't really productive. You know, it doesn't help Israel's narrative to then start saying that they're just all lies, that it's all bad. But it is a hard, nuanced position to take that, you know, some of it is true. And that's why we're working to stop it in this way and that way, because we want to preserve good overall. And I think that a lot of the time the same applies with the Palestinians, although I think that at Duke, they were less polarized in a way. I think they were more willing to engage on some of our activism than the DIPAC, the APAC-ish group was. We didn't always agree with what they were doing on their own, but I could usually engage with them. I think that one of the bigger issues I encountered, that which Morgan was starting to talk about, was sort of the apathetic folks in the middle. And at least from the Jewish side, there were an awful lot of people who said, yes, this sounds like a good position, but oh, it's hopeless. We can't do anything about it. Why should I spend my time on it? Or it sounds like a good position. So I guess it's a variation of that. You know, there is nothing to be done, or there's nothing I can do, which sound the same but are not quite. The first one is kind of this, you know, we're fated to fight. You know, it's an ancient war, which isn't necessarily true. It's kind of misinformed about what actually the conflict is based on. But then there's also this narrative that, you know, I just want to get by in my Jewish circles. I just want to make my career in X. I don't want to rock the boat. Plus, what even can be done? You know, J Street, okay, you're going to elect some politician somewhere. What's that matter? And so a lot of the work is really showing that large group of people, here is something simple you can do that matters. Here's the whatever level of the grand strategy is. You know, but if we can protect Palestinian villages, it's harder to, you know, annex the West Bank, because there are people there that need to be given citizenship, or else there's some major consequences. If there were an annexation bill, for example. And there's all sorts of other strategies like this that we can get into.
Yeah, so I started the JSTU chapter at UMass this year, and it was because I went to meetings of the Students Alliance for Israel. They didn't really tackle the Palestinian perspective, and when I tried to bring it up, or other people tried to bring it up, they wanted to move the conversation very quickly because they didn't want to acknowledge it. And then I also went to meetings of Students for Justice in Palestine, and they said that Israel shouldn't exist. And I also couldn't agree with that. So I started the chapter because I felt like we needed kind of a middle where we both, we could recognize that there are two sides to the story, and until they work together, nothing's gonna get done. Hillel was very receptive. I was an intern at UMass Hillel, so they were very accepting of the fact that I wanted to start this, and they were very supportive. And we've been working with the Students Alliance for Israel a lot. So, and they've been really supportive and receptive to what we're doing, because a lot of them agree in private, but they don't want to do it publicly. So now that JSTU exists, they feel like they don't have to. But Hillel, especially when we talk about certain things like the occupation and what needs to happen for Israel to uphold the occupation, these really awful things that we talk about in JSTU, about how the IDF is very, like, harasses Palestinians very often and things like that. They get very afraid when we have those conversations because they don't want to criticize Israel because they're afraid of what other people are going to say in both sides. So it's a very complicated climate to organize in, but I think it's a lot of other people have been very receptive, and I'm very excited of what we've been able to do as a chapter. And I think it's an important conversation to be having in college campuses, especially because UMass has a really big Jewish community. And we also have a very strong SJP chapter. So I think that's why it's so important for us to be doing this work right now.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to how you all have gone about organizing. We have a question here about how does J Street approach the BDS movement?
So I can answer that one, I think, pretty well. So I say I can answer pretty well. I don't work for J Street. I'm not an official spokesperson for J Street, but my impression of the official J Street stance on BDS is J Street opposes the BDS movement for sure, and opposes any boycotting, divestment, sanctions movement of Israel. But J Street does not take a stance on limited, boycott, divestment, sanctions movements of settlements in the West Bank, as long as those are, those movements, actions, whatever, recognize the right of Israel proper to exist. J Street doesn't support that kind of boycott, but it won't take a stance on it. I personally don't buy things from settlements. I personally do everything in my power to resist supporting settlements in the West Bank. Now, that doesn't mean I think all of them need to be uprooted tomorrow. I think it's quite clear some of them in a final status negotiation, land swaps would become part of Israel. I'd be happy to go visit them. Some of them are quite interesting, I'm sure. They're in biblically interesting places, whatever. But it's an active conflict zone. And I don't think it's fair to prejudge the final outcome. So actually, this is something I think I do think that J Street is hoping to make some kind of push on the settlements in the near future. A lot of countries have requirements that goods from Israeli settlements, including the US actually, goods from Israeli settlements cannot be labeled as from Israel. The US Customs Agency, it's a law that they can't be labeled as from Israel, but they're labeled from Israel anyway. And under the Trump administration, that rule was not enforced. And this is something that I know J Street would like to see enforced better in the future in what will now be a Biden administration. And I think that the Biden administration will be quite open to that. Keeping that delineation between what is really Israel and what is not is it's an important part of making sure that the Israeli government, but also Israeli people and Israeli businesses understand that there's a border. Because I think one of the great challenges to making a solution here is that at this point, a lot of Israelis, including who live in settlements, don't even know that they live in settlements. They don't know what the green line is. They don't know why it's a problem. They don't even know that there is a problem. And so I think that that's a really important distinction to keep making.
Yeah, and I think even I think J Street's main mission is not Palestine. I think there's a lot of different practices of Palestinian solidarity that J Street takes part in, such as J Street U partnering with different villages throughout the West Bank to bring international attention to them, and pushes on social media and just generally bringing awareness. And so I think that Palestinian solidarity can be practiced in more ways than is often presented to just American, the American people, is that there's more ways than using, I think, very charged political language to actually achieve change. And that's something that I think J Street holds very dear to them, and is very obvious in the way that they supported the Iran deal, and the way that they continue to push, just as Josh was saying, for to have actually labeled is this from the West Bank or is this from Israel, and just kind of pushing for different acts of Palestinian solidarity instead of that. I think actually reaches more people, because you say, oh, BDS, it often kind of flags and makes people very uncomfortable. It makes them very hostile and not want to talk to you. And so I think by practicing the different elements of solidarity that J Street does, it also helps kind of work towards J Street pro-diplomacy, like goes along even deeper with that mission.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Josh and Morgan said. I just want to add to what happens when you tell people in college campuses that you are not pro-BDS, because a lot of people consider that as you are not actually pro-Palestine because you do not support Palestinian solidarity, and you have to, as J Street Youth Chapter, we have to educate people on those other ways that Morgan talked about and how to practice Palestinian solidarity outside a movement that I personally find very problematic. And J Street also finds it problematic because we don't support BDS, but also how to talk to people in the pro-Israel side about how I don't support legislation that would punish people for believing in BDS, because there's this movement kind of in the right wing side of the pro-Israel movement that wants to silence people or punish people through legislation for supporting BDS, including businesses. So it's kind of it's really difficult to tell both sides that you don't support BDS, but you also don't want to support anything that would silence people who support BDS, because in this country we believe in freedom of speech, and that also gives you the freedom to protest and boycott whatever you want, however you want. However, I disagree with it, and through education, I try to get people to disagree with the BDS movement as well.
Yeah, so I think some other points worth thinking about on Palestinian solidarity and the BDS movement is, I think that there is a difference, first of all, between the global BDS movement and efforts to boycott or divest from or sanction bad Israeli practices. The global BDS movement rejects Jewish self-determination, explicitly. It does not believe, it doesn't just believe in the state of Israel. It doesn't think Jews have a right to their own political future in what is also our homeland. If you're from the Palestinian perspective, it is also Jews' homeland. And so that's the main reason that I really disagree with the movement. I don't really have a huge problem with people, perhaps sporadically, independently of the movement, boycotting or divesting from or wanting to put certain penalties on certain types of Israeli actions, whatever they may be. Although I don't think I would push for those, and I still push for American military aid to Israel to defend itself, for example, from rockets from Gaza. That's not lethal aid that can hurt Palestinians, but it can defend Israel. I think there's lots of very complicated distinctions to make in the types of things you can hit Israel with or support Israel with. And I think that the key problem with the global BDS movement ends up being that while it doesn't really accomplish much, it does trigger Israeli fear. Going back to how do we make solutions, triggering fear that, that doesn't make Israel take action and makes Israelis hunker down and do nothing like they did in Syria on the Golan border. And that's what the Israeli right understands really, really well. They know that the BDS movement has done nothing to harm Israel, yet they've made it the biggest existential threat in all Israelis' mind. And the reason that Israel can never admit to doing anything wrong, can never change its behavior, is because those BDS people are going to come after us for this. And so I don't think that actually, the BDS movement per se will make a difference unless your objective is basically to conquer Israel economically, which I don't think will happen.
Wow, thank you guys for a really insightful response. We really appreciate that. We do have another question from the audience, and it is, have any of you found it difficult to keep a balanced view of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians?
I think I wrestle with that question a lot, especially whenever I'm looking at the other, when I look at power disparities in America, and I'm looking at the racial reckoning that our entire country has been going through. I'm looking at gender disparities, wealth disparities, and I'm looking at all this power. Like if you're just strictly looking at systems of power, it is hard to just like kind of take it. It's like you look at Israel-Palestine face value, and you can see another power disparity. And so I wrestle with a little bit of that. Inevitably, what it comes back down to for me is like, I don't, in Israel-Palestine, I fundamentally believe that both peoples are connected to this land, and I don't think that any one person's or any one side's claim is any more valid than another, because to invalidate somebody's like historical attachment to the land is to invalidate so much more about who they are as a person and who they are as a people. It's like to say, oh, your history, well, that just isn't important. And so it's like, while I look at the occupation and I look at what happens with what happens to Palestinians, but then I can also see I can very much see the Israeli side. So it's like they feel like they're being attacked. They don't have peace partners. They don't have people that they feel like they can work with. And so it's like, I can so easily see both sides whenever I actually try to engage with both. I think it's very easy to just kind of go in with one lens and then not bother looking at where this through a different lens or even through the opposite perspective. And I think fundamentally what gets me to continue being pro Israel, pro Palestine, I vehemently think that both peoples are important, and that you can use both labels in tandem with each other, and that they're not contradictory. And I don't see any way to say I'm pro only one without entirely invalidating the existence of another. So I think that inevitably is what keeps me not really wavering from the middle, from this joint position.
Yeah, I think going back to what I said before, when you understand that there's so much pain on both sides, it's hard to tell someone your pain is not valid because this other person also feels pain. And it's kind of hard to come up with a solution that recognizes both people's history and pain and the things they've gone through, and also what they've done. So the short answer is yes, I struggle with it. And the long answer is also yes, I struggle with that because there's so much there. And it's really hard. And I think that's the hardest part of this job, and just the work that J Street does, trying to see both perspectives, is really important, but it's also really difficult. And most people don't want to think about it that way because we feel like we need to pick sides. And I think that's very human. But it's also, I think it should be also human to recognize that there is a lot of pain on both sides, and we need to find a solution that addresses all of that.
Yeah, I mostly just agree with what Morgan and Carla have said. I think that thinking about whether, so I guess where I wrestle is whether there's a balanced view between Israelis and Palestinians or between Israel and Palestine. I think I do a fairly good job, at least I hope, keeping in the political world, I personally obviously have close ties to Israelis and not really so much the Palestinians, and I care a lot about part of about Israeli culture and history, and Palestinian culture is interesting to me in the way that a lot of Middle Eastern culture is, but it's not mine. But I think that Israelis and Palestinians in the political world, it's just different. There's Israel as a political entity. It's one of the most powerful countries in the world, actually, which is amazing given its size. Kind of goes to the success of the Zionist dream in a way. But it has aligned itself with a lot of powers that I really don't think are good. The Gulf Arab monarchies and Egypt and various right-wing populist authoritarian leaders across the world, they're kind of winning these days and not for good. And so I really have a tough time saying that the United States should do more than it already does to support them versus the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not a state. They have been mostly abandoned in political structures by most of their traditional allies. So I think that I don't necessarily think it's unbalanced to take an unbalanced approach at this moment, as long as you remember that the core is we're still trying to defend Israelis and Palestinians and their long-range projects. But at the moment, Israelis don't need more support than they're already getting.
Thank you for that. Did anybody else have something to add before I move on to the next question? Okay. I would like to know, how would you encourage young adults like us to stay involved with this issue if they've been introduced, or how to even get involved in the first place?
This is going to be a shameless plug for the J Street Advocacy Corps, which I think is probably, it's a really good space to bring questions and conversations. And Ruti has already kind of put it in the chat, links to the Advocacy Corps, but it's just kind of like being willing, like actually just searching out people to talk about it with, is I think probably like the biggest key. And like J Street is very open to conversations with people on all sides, and that's something that I think the organization does very well, is that everybody is kind of coming from a place where they know that they are asking questions. Like nobody knows everything, and it's very easy to kind of talk yourself out of something because you're like, oh, well, I just don't know enough. And I think that in and of itself is like one of the most crippling aspects, and like can I really hold people back, is just telling themselves, oh, I don't know enough, therefore I can't get involved, or it's too late, XYZ, who knows. And that's just not true. You're never, like, nobody knows everything. Like I only have so much knowledge, Josh only has so much knowledge, and so does Carla, and like everybody on this call. It's just like actively searching out these conversations and being willing to listen and being willing to grow in your perspective. But that would be my main encouragement, is like I found a great community in J Street. So I would encourage that, but also just never being scared of asking questions, and never being scared of having those conversations.
Yeah, I think what I would just say quickly here is that there are plenty of policymakers and policy experts that know all the stuff and have studied all the things that can be studied. I would encourage you, if you're interested in how could we possibly make a deal between Israel and Palestine, to look at two-state security. This is an Israeli security perspective from Israeli security officials, talking about all of the deals and all of the intermittent steps and how eminently possible it is to make a deal. And there's loads of things like this from every think tank imaginable. What the world doesn't necessarily need is more people who understand it. It needs people who are willing to stand up and say, look, I know that Israelis and Palestinians both, have legitimate claims, and we need to make a solution. We need to push, you people who have power, you go listen to these people who know what they're doing. I'm not going to tell you what you need to do. It's not my job. I'm an activist. I'm going to push you to go listen to people who do know. Because the problem is not that people don't know, it's that politicians don't listen to them, right? So that's all I'll add here.
Yeah, another thought about J Street is that they have a lot of webinars. So if you want to learn more, they have a lot of resources for you to learn, because I don't know everything and I'm still learning. And there's also, J Street always has something new to add. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. And as Josh said, I would just get involved by pushing your elected officials. Like we as Americans have a lot of power in this democracy, and we don't always realize that. The politicians do what they think is gonna get them reelected. And if you push them to adopt these policies that recognize human rights and the humanity on both sides, and push them to do the right thing, they're gonna do it, because that's on their best interest, but it's also on the best interest of the US and the future of the Middle East. So you can start locally with your representatives and go from there, because as Josh said, what we need to do is push politicians to listen to the people that already know. Right now, some of these policies are not popular because they're afraid that they're going to lose support from the pro-Israel community. They can get a lot of support from, if we show them that they can get a lot of support from the pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace community, that's when they're actually going to do it.
And I think also, like, I'm gonna say personally, if anybody were to like want to reach out to me and like specifically talk about this, and like have a more like one-on-one conversation where the questions are being asked, I'm always more than happy to talk about Israel, Palestine, and the politics that are going on there. It's my favorite place in the world, holds a lot of different emotions for me. So like that's one of my favorite things to do. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat. And again, feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your responses. There's so many ways to be involved, and that's really encouraging. So as our final question, I'm going to ask you guys just a simple question, but a powerful one. Where do you all find hope in the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I find hope in a lot of different areas, but I think the one that most stands out to me is while I was in Israel, I got to interact with and learn about this group called Kids for Peace. And it is an organization that brings, in Jerusalem, that brings children of all backgrounds, so Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, Palestinian, Israeli Arab, like all kind of different identities together, and is this peace initiative to just like have them learn together and have them just interact and play. And I think seeing these kids just run around, even kicking around a soccer ball, that gives me hope. Is like I know that it's like fundamentally not hard. It's more just like at the bottom, it's there. Like at the bottom, at the ground level, people can. It's just a matter of making sure that they know that they can. But I think that is a glowing light for me.
I think that where I draw my hope from is organizations like CMEP and all of the people that are involved from all walks of life. I've seen, I've seen the salience of this issue grow and grow and grow over the years, and it hasn't gotten, despite a lot of fear-mongering from the old guard of the pro-Israel community that more attention to this will just make everyone hate Israel. It doesn't seem like it's going that way so far. And so I think that that's something that's been really inspiring to me in this country.
I find my hope in young people. 2 weeks ago, we had our final phone bank for Joe Biden, and more than almost 200 people showed up, and it was mostly young people, JSTU students who had, mostly in college, who had homework to do and papers to write, and they still found time on a Sunday to come phone bank for Joe Biden because they felt that it was important for the future of Israel and Palestine, but also the U.S. So I think, and that's happening with other issues all over the country, young people organizing and dedicating their time and efforts to creating a better future for everyone. So I'm very excited that there are organizations like JSTU and CMEP who are organizing it, because it's important that we change our thinking and the way we think best doing things. So that's where I find my hope.
Thank you all for sharing.